Hello, welcome to this presentation on the main lesson journey. I'm Andrew Hill and I'm the head of school at Glenean Rudolf Steiner School in Sydney, and I've been a class teacher for 3 cycles. I've taken classes through 3 sets of 8 years, and so I've taught all the main lessons that you're going to hear about today. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is not so much the individual main lessons, but the lessons, the story that they create. You'll no doubt be learning about individual main lessons, you'll be learning about main lesson units and the stories that you tell. But what I want to present to you today is the sense that the whole curriculum is a story. In one sense, it all fits together as a narrative. And it's a very unique narrative that tells the story of the development of human consciousness, human life, human mind, all the different cultures of the world, that really puts together what we call the human story. So we're going to cover quite a bit of ground. And as a little theme for this, I'd like to share with you the famous quote from William Blake: "To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour." We're going to cover a little bit of eternity over the next hour. First of all, let's just talk a little bit about what main lessons are. Main lessons are a unique aspect of the Rudolf Steiner curriculum. I always see them as one of the, Steiner's genius in the foundation of Steiner schools. The main lesson is a very particular, special way of learning. It's a form of deep learning where you learn in a block for 2 hours every morning over 3 weeks, and then you move on to another one. And all the key academic subjects are presented in these blocks. The rest of the timetable, the rest of the day, is what we call a more rhythmic timetable of learning the things that you need to do week by week, things like languages, sport, crafts, games, all the eurythmy, all the different subjects that we need to learn in a regular, repetitive manner. But in the main lessons, we really focus on deep learning, where the student is able to be immersed in one big idea. And that's the idea, it's a big idea. But more than that, it's also, in a sense, a story in itself. Now, by big idea, I mean it's a big topic. So the first one we do, of course, in the beginning of class 1 is the alphabet. So we introduce literacy by bringing the alphabet to students. But all the way through the school, right up to year 11 and 12, we maintain the main lesson structure of the morning so that the students are learning in depth in what I'd call almost a story form. So the main lesson itself, the task of the teacher in each main lesson is to create a sense of narrative in their learning. Now, this was one of Steiner's intuitions about how best we learn. And what's remarkable is that over the 20th century, over the past 100 years, we've now determined through a lot of mainstream research that we learn best when information is presented to us in a context. Just learning random information is very, in a sense, arduous. The simplest and the best way of taking on any kind of information is to put it into a context. And the best context for the human mind is a story. So let's just have a look at a year 8 main lesson that we teach at our school on Shakespeare, which we do every year 8, part of their sort of English developments. Now, of course, you can present Shakespeare in a number of ways. You can present his biography, you can present the Elizabethan theatre, you can present different numbers of his plays. In a sense, they're all kind of randomized. The task of the teacher is to bring it together in a coherent unit that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, just as a story does. And when you do this, you actually put information into a meaningful context. You can even do it with maths. Even if you're teaching such an abstract subject as, say, Pythagoras' theorem, you do in year 7, or even decimals, percentages, you bring all this random information together and you present it in a block that is a meaningful unit. And so the teacher's task is to, in a sense, turn information into a story. And we know now that this is the best way, the simplest way that the human mind is able to comprehend a range of different facts and information. You bring it together in a story. And most importantly, we give our students the skills to build a creative response to their learning. Create a story in the teacher's task, and then give the students the skills, the creative arts, so that they can respond in a creative manner. Now, these are shots from our introduction to chemistry in year 7, where the students are learning about acids and bases. Now, they start with a fire, and they see that something goes up and something goes down. Ashes left, smoke goes up. There's fire and combustion in the middle. Over the next 3 weeks, they track these two processes in different directions. One goes down into the alkali cycle, one goes into the cycle of acids. And at the end of the journey, they're able to present here the pH scale of the difference between acids and bases. They've turned chemistry into a story, and the students have been able to make here, as you can see, a creative response. They've been able to internalize it and bring out a creative response to their learning. Now, this is a profoundly important aspect of Steiner education, that we build creativity into the learning process. The learning process itself needs to be creative. And this is what really means, this is what really deep learning truly means. Now, that's the actual task of the main lesson. But let's look really now at the overall shape of the main lessons as they run all the way from class 1 all the way through to the senior high school. We talk about running through all these main lessons a golden thread. Now, each year the students do 12 main lessons, which are spread over the key learning areas of English and maths and science, history and geography. And over the course of those key academic areas, the students build, in a sense, the blocks of their understanding in English, in maths, in science. And they build gradually, like any curriculum does, a series of meaningful units that build toward competence in that particular subject discipline. But weaving through it all, like a fabric that has a golden thread woven through it, is a particular story, and it's the story of humanity. Through the main lesson journey, we build the story of how humanity came to be as we are today, to think the way that we do today. Now, we're all a bit like fish in the sea. Fish, of course, have no idea that they're surrounded by water or that there's air above. They just know this is their world. And so people at any given time naturally assume that people have always thought as we do, that people have always lived as we do. Well, of course, we haven't. It's taken thousands and thousands of years, slow, cumulative progress, for us to have reached the state where we are today. And to understand the world today, to really understand in depth, you need to have a sense of how we got to be here now. In fact, the best way of approaching anything is to try and work toward a gradual understanding of how things evolved and grew so that we know who we are today. And today, of course, around the world, in Australia, we're very fortunate where we live. We have the democracy, we have human rights, and these are, in a sense, the benchmark for values around the world. But it was not always so. In fact, in human history, the ideals of democracy, human rights, the sense of individual freedoms that we all enjoy, have slowly, gradually developed. They've taken a long time. And many people have put their lives into the task of shaping the world that we are here today. As Newton famously said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And what we enjoy today is the result of the generations of those who have come before us. What I want to share today is really this development of the human mind as it's taken place through many cultures in many countries until we have the worldwide consciousness we have today. And this is an understanding of the golden thread that runs through the main lesson curriculum. And the big question is, where did we come from and who are we? Now, many people have put their minds to this big question. Paul Gauguin was a very famous French artist at the end of the 19th century. He became disenchanted with Western civilization and went off to Tahiti, where he lived with the First Nations peoples of the Pacific. And then he painted a very famous picture, which was in his kind of trying to put together the development of humanity. And in the corner of this picture, there was a famous statement that he'd lived with for all his life. In French, it means, where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? As this has been a question that has been asked so often by great minds, by all of us, when we've pondered human life. So where do we start? Where do we come from? Well, let's go right back to the beginning. And in Australia, we're very fortunate because we share this continent with the oldest culture on earth. Australia's First Nations people have the longest continuous culture of any community, any culture on earth. And these are some shots that I'm going to share with you that were taken well over 100 years ago, some of the earliest photos that were ever taken of traditional ceremonies of Australia's Indigenous people. This is taken from the Spencer and Gillen expedition to Alice Springs in about 1898, very, very early on. And it indicates to us a very different consciousness. And by really deeply, sympathetically, and with deep respect, understanding the consciousness of Australia's traditional First Nations people, we really get a glimpse into how humanity began on Earth, our first consciousness. Let's have a look. If we were to put it into diagrammatic form, you will have heard of the understanding of the dreaming, what white people sometimes call the dream time, but in Aboriginal languages was traditionally referred to as the dreaming of long ago. And Aboriginal people had a sense of a power behind life, behind material life that we see, that they called the dreaming. And the dreaming was a remarkable conception shared across the whole continent by all Indigenous groups in Australia. And the dreaming's central notion was that there was life existed as a kind of alternating consciousness between dreaming, where we all come from, and now. We all start in this state of dreaming, which is the state of the ancestors and all the spiritual beings who had created the world. When we're born, we step out into life. We come out into the now time. When we die, we return to dreaming. When we wake up each morning, we wake up and we come out, and then when we go to sleep, we return to dreaming and go back into this deep, ancient state. During ceremonies, during normal life is secular and open, but in ceremonies, the men and the women in their different ways had secret business where they would go into the sacred world of dreaming. And Australia's people refer to this as being the difference between outside and inside. Life had two sides. And in fact, no one, I think, has ever found a word for time in traditional First Nations languages in Australia. There is always a sense of either it's dreaming or it's now. Now, this is a remarkable conception, a very beautiful one. The world was shaped by the ancestors who come from dreaming. They shaped the landscape. They shaped all the facets of the earth, the rocks, the boulders, the streams, the plains, all the land that we live on, and we are their descendants. And in dreaming, we return to them. It's the most beautiful, extraordinary understanding of life. Everything fits into this pattern of the order laid down in the dreaming. It gave us sets of stories of where the world came from, and it gave a sense of order. And most importantly, it also gave a sense of ordering of social life, because everyone belonged to a particular section in the community. Every group that spoke the same language, everyone in that group, their family life was based on a place within this dreaming system. Now, there are many different forms of this across the country. This is one taken from a large stretch of Western Australia, where the section system had these particular groups. Everyone in each community belonged to one set of families, and you were either male or female within these. TJs are male, Ns are female. So this family group, the Angalas, you were either a Changala as a male or Nangala as a woman. And there were 8 groups, and everyone belonged to one of these. You were born into one of these, and this is how it worked. These lines represent the marriage groups between them. Everyone had to marry a particular group. If I'm a Changala man, I have to marry a Nangarai woman. If I'm a Changarai man, I marry a Nangala woman. If I belong to this group, I marry this group. And these were laid down geometrically as giving the structure to their society. Now, children went a different way. If I'm a Nangarai woman, my children belong to Nampinchin. If I'm a Nangala woman, my children belong to Chapulchari. How it works over the generations is if I'm a Changarai man, I marry a Nangala woman, and our children belong to Chapulchari. So my son, if I'm a Changarai man, it's a Chapulchari man, he marries a Nakamara woman, and their child belongs to my group as a Changarai. So my grandchild belongs to the same group as me. Now, of course, this means that my children belong to this group here. My sister's children my nieces and nephews belong to this group. This group here is my daughter-in-law belongs to this group. My mother-in-law belongs to this group. My mother's grandmother belongs to this group. Everyone had a place. The family was laid out in these groups, and each of these groups had its own dreaming, coming from the dreaming. In fact, this structure was laid down in the dreaming. And each group had its own particular relationship. So this is what's even called, this is my mother-in-law's group if I'm a Chang'erai man. This is my mother-in-law's group, and I avoid my mother-in-law. This was one of the rules. They called it an avoidance rule. But every group I had a particular way of relating to. These are my in-laws. These are my nieces and nephews. These are my children. These are my daughter-in-law. This is my mother-in-law who I avoid. This is my mother's grandmother. And if we would put it all together, it makes the most remarkable geometric pattern. Now this was written down by Aboriginal people in the Western Desert to explain to non-Aboriginal people how this system works. And this is how it looks overall. So a whole group of people, if I'm one person here, my relationships to each of these other people are laid down by what is expected of me because of the particular relationship. To my in-laws, I obviously have a nice, friendly, sweet relationship, but I'm careful. This is my children who I take responsibility for. These are my nieces and nephews. This is the negative group, my mother-in-law, who I avoid. And they have a group, kind of a group relationship, such that I refer to a number of the people in this group as all by the same term. So in other words, my social life is laid down for me. It's a remarkably symmetrical, beautiful, intense system. Now this is the beginnings of, this is how human life in a sense began. If you look at First Nations around the world, all have something similar to this. Everything is based on family, a very strong community where the individual is held as a member of family, and relationships with each other are determined by our family ties. We're held strongly in a community. And most importantly, even more so, we have this sense of being part of the natural world. We're the part of, we are embedded in nature, and the myths and the stories that were told, the stories of the origins, all had in them this sense of being part of the natural world, where there was a sense of oneness between ourselves and the world. We lived with family groups and we were embedded in the natural world. Now, for Aboriginal people, of course, this consciousness was how they saw the environment. So when they saw structures like some of the great tors that are out in the centre of Australia, they saw this as the work of the ancestors. And they saw it as the dreaming sites where life began. And not only that, but they saw it through a particular consciousness where they could look down on and see relationships between different aspects of country in terms of these dreaming origins. They were embedded in the world. There was a sense of oneness between them and the world, the most beautiful, original consciousness of humanity. Now, if we were to describe it in a sense diagrammatically, we would have it something like this. The sense of self and the world are at one. Now, this is the original human consciousness. Very beautiful, very simple, very profound. Now, all of us, in a sense, if we look at our own childhood, we look at children, our children, when you look at children, you see that they too have a beautiful consciousness like this. They have a sense of being part of the world, where the world is a special place and they are, in a sense, carried by the world. They're carried by the people around them, but they have a wonderful sense of the specialness of the world. You know, those walks you go on with children where everything is special. Look, it's a white rock. Look, it's a red leaf. Everything has a special sense of unity. Wordsworth expressed this very beautifully in his famous poem, Ode on Immortality. There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every sight to me did seem, apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. Heaven lies around us in our infancy. This was a great poet being able to remember back to his own time as a child, with great imagination and being able to express this wonderful sense of unity in the world. Heaven lies around us in our infancy. Of course, naturally, at some point in our world, this comes to an end and we start to separate. We start to feel different. And the observations of many people, parents, teachers, as we understand how this works as children grow, as we know, around the age of about 8 or 9, we start to feel separate from the world. We naturally start to disengage. In our time, the child starts to separate out. We talk about in Steiner schools the 9-year change, when this gradual sense of unity with the world is starting to separate. And it leads to a sense of almost a crisis of feeling separate. But until that time, the child is still embedded in this world. Now, we start our main lesson journey in our schools by honouring this early consciousness. And the stories we tell in our first main lessons in kindergarten, but particularly in the main lessons in class 1 and class 2, are really stories which try to capture this sense of unity in the world, this sense of magical possibilities. Because the basis of this consciousness, what I call embedded consciousness, is one of feeling that the world is a unity. It's expressed through simple things that you find in stories, such as animals and people speak the same language. Magical things can happen, like a flying boat. The world is full of magical possibilities. This is what we call the fairy tale consciousness, and this is what we find in fairy tales, this sense of unity with the world. The farmer went into the forest, and there he found a fox. And the fox said to him, "If you cut down this tree, you'll find a golden goose." So the farmer took his axe, cut down the tree, and there in the stump was a golden goose. The farmer took the goose home, gave it to his wife, who put it in the hen pen, and the next morning there was a golden egg. It's a magical story. The laws of physics, the laws of biology, in a sense, don't apply. It is a world of magical possibilities. The farmer and the fox speak to each other. There is a golden egg. These are the wonderful stories that children in this early age, before this separation, love to hear. It expresses the world of embeddedness and of connection. It's in a sense how all of us have a wonderful origin in a First Nations consciousness. It's our beautiful beginning. But gradually we change and we step out from this. And in our main lesson journey, we honour this in class 1 and 2 by stories which begin with a fairy tale consciousness. That's why we tell fairy tales from around the world, Grimm's fairy tales, Russian fairy tales of all, wherever they come from, that have this particular quality of magical possibilities and unity in the world. And of course, with a moral outcome, where good prevails over the not so good. Now, gradually we move out of this. And over the journey of class 2, our stories start to take on a greater sophistication. So often a lot of schools tell the story of the King of Ireland's son, which has a more sophisticated fairy tale consciousness to it. But then in class 3, when the child is turning 9, the beginnings of this separation, we need to bring to them some stories which bring a different kind of consciousness. And traditionally, we're told stories from the Hebrew Testament. You may wonder why that's the case. Well, there are some particular things in that story. The Hebrew Testament is, in fact, the first, I think, recorded history of that we have in humanity. It's the first written down form of more extant history, going back such a long time. But it also represents the struggles of an individual people to find their own identity. And it really reflects the struggles that the 9-year-old child can feel about feeling themselves as a separate individual. And the stories of the Hebrew people that are expressed in those stories are all about the struggles, tribulations of a people finding their identity. The phrase that comes through so often is strangers in a strange land. And this is very much the experience that a 9-year-old can go through in this time of crisis, of feeling themselves as an individual. It's very much an existential crisis. Now, the child goes through that in class 3, In class 4, so around the age of turning 10, we take them into the world of Norse myths. Now, these again have a particular story. These were actually the indigenous stories of Europe. These were the stories before what we think of now as European civilization developed. These were their indigenous background. And they have a wonderful power that the 10-year-old really, really enjoys. But they have a special quality. The Norse myths actually, they're unlike other mythologies and origin stories in that they actually have an end with the Great War of Ragnarok, where there is the great battle, the earth is cleansed, and the two characters step forward ready for a new world. It's effectively the end of childhood. And so this journey represents the end of this consciousness, this original primal consciousness for the child. And then in class 5, we step into formal history as such. And we take the children now on a long journey that's going to take them over, well, a story that has taken thousands of years to unfold. We're going to take them over many cultures, many countries, all leading up to shaping the world as we are today. So let's have a look at how we begin this journey. We start off with some of the very ancient cultures, the great cultures that were very rich, very sophisticated, the culture of China and its magnificent, extraordinary history. We move into ancient India, and we take the class through the experiences of ancient India, of the great stories, the great gems of tradition of the ancient Indian traditions, Bhagavad Gita. We usually tell a story such as the Ramayana of Rama and Sita, and the great experiences, the philosophy that lies behind Hinduism and the original Vedic wisdom of ancient India. It's a very beautiful beginning of this journey into human history. If you look back, for example, on even the European languages, if you trace those languages all the way back, all the European languages, all the Central European, even the Middle Eastern languages, they all start with Sanskrit. It's the kind of the root language. And it indicates how this journey begins with ancient India. Then we move into the Middle East and the next stages of civilizations that developed with the civilization of Persia, with Zarathustra, and the great civilizations that flourished around the Tigris and Euphrates. And then the journey moves on to the great stories of ancient Egypt. We take the children through the remarkable civilizations that developed around the Nile. Now, each of these civilizations, there is a cumulative step. And by the time we get to ancient Egypt, we're dealing with a very sophisticated civilization that had a remarkable philosophy and that had a deep wisdom and a remarkable social structure. And behind it was the beginnings of a very profound sense of understanding the world, astronomy, mathematics. But the end of the Egyptian civilization leads into then the developments around the Mediterranean. And there's a great step between ancient Egypt and the next great civilization that rises in history. And this is the story of the Greeks. Now, there's a big turning point, a great turning point, because the end of Egypt and the beginning of Greece marks a significant change in human consciousness. Let's have a look at the story that really is most famous as the marking point between these civilizations. You will know the story of the War of Troy, how the great story of how Helen of Troy was abducted, seduced by Paris, taken back to Troy, and there was a war for 10 years between the Trojans and the Greeks, led by Agamemnon. They lay siege, they couldn't defeat the Trojans, until at last the great Odysseus comes up with a kind of trick that tricks the Trojan. He builds a horse, a wooden horse, that appears to be left as a gift from the gods. But Odysseus and his men are hidden inside. The Greeks leave, the Trojans think they've won the war, they pull the horse into Troy itself, they have a great celebration, and afterwards, when they're all asleep, Odysseus opens the horse, the men come out, they open the gate, the Greeks return, and of course they defeat the Trojans. And this begins the kind of the origins of the great civilization of ancient Greece. Now, the move between the Egyptians and the Greeks is profound in a very significant way. You see, all the civilizations before this had a particular character that almost has its origins in that First Nations consciousness we talked about at the beginning. Talked about how for First Nations, the sense of the world being created by the ancestors, by the gods, and we live out the shape of society, the shape of the world that those gods have laid down. This is the mythological consciousness. And each of those civilizations I've mentioned, each of them shared this characteristic. The Egyptians built it to an incredibly sophisticated way, where the pharaoh was like the god on earth, and the shape of society represented almost the shape of heaven. And everyone lived out their role. Now, the Greeks begin a whole new consciousness. They start to think independently. They start to think in a new way. And the trick that Odysseus works on the Trojans, who were still more in the older kind of consciousness of trusting in the gods, Odysseus comes up with an individual trick of the human mind, that he's able to win the war for the Greeks. And this leads into a whole new civilization that has its center around Athens in Greece, a beautiful civilization that produces the Parthenon, the great dramas of ancient Greece, the great structures, the great architecture. But at the core of it is a new consciousness that's represented by the great individual who was known as the first scientist in history, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle represents the new consciousness, a new way of thinking that didn't really exist prior to this historically. You see, the earlier consciousness saw the world as the result of the work of the gods. Say, for example, a thunderstorm came, and there was lightning and there was thunder. Then an Egyptian or an earlier would have said, this is the work of a god. If you were a Viking, for example, you would say this was the work of Thor hurling his thunderbolts. In Australia's First Nations consciousness, you would say this was Lightning Man hurling his thunderbolts down on the earth. Now, among the Greeks, for the first time, a new consciousness emerges. People start to look at the world, and they start to notice phenomena, and they start to, in a sense, deconstruct the natural world. When they looked at that, when they looked at the lightning and thunder, they would say, well, I noticed it was very hot, and then it got very cold. There was warmth in the air, then there was moisture, and then there was cold. And they started to understand how natural phenomena are caused by the elements working together. Elements that, in a sense, don't have a god or some animate being behind them. They start to look at nature in a new way, as a separate thing from us and something that is inanimate. It doesn't have life or being behind it, which is what the earlier civilizations all had a sense of being. Now, this is the beginnings of the way we think now. And the Greeks are the first step on this long development of the human mind understanding the world as an inanimate being, which is, of course, the beginnings of science. The science that we understand today, the consciousness that has shaped the world such that everyone today thinks a bit like this. In Aristotle's time, there was just a tiny group of people. But gradually, this has now spread. And what I'm going to share with you now is this journey of how this consciousness and the impact that this had on the world today. Now, this moment in time is marked much later on by a very famous artist called Raphael. And he painted a picture, which is a very famous picture, which is called the School of Athens. And in Athens, there was a very famous school founded by Plato and Socrates, the Platonic Academy, where people they started to learn to think in this new way. And it was carried on by Aristotle. And Raphael painted a famous picture called the School of Athens, where he tried to capture this turning point in time, this turning point in human consciousness. And at the center of all these people, which was the School of Athens, which was, in a sense, the first real university that we would understand, where people discoursed, where there were philosophers, mathematicians, they thought. And at the center of this picture are two individuals. One of them is representing the older consciousness. As you can see here, someone is pointing up and someone is pointing down. Now, these two figures are meant to represent the two key personalities of this turning point in Greek consciousness. This is Plato, who still thought about the world as having been sourced from the gods and everything having a spiritual origin. The other side, this is Aristotle, the younger Aristotle, and he's pointing downwards. He's pointing down to the earth. And there, it's a symbolic picture which is expressing the view. The older consciousness looked up to the gods. The new consciousness looked to the earth, to understand the earth in a secular way. And this is the turning point captured in this moment between these two individuals. Now the story continues, and a great individual called Alexander the Great, he's one of the most famous personalities in history, who then leads a campaign to take this new Greek culture across the Middle East. And he goes on this extraordinary journey from Greece all the way through Palestine, through Egypt, right across, even reaches India, one of the most extraordinary sort of military campaigns ever recorded. People still write about it. And he ends up back in Babylon. But he takes this new consciousness and spreads it right across the world as it was known at that time. And everywhere he went, he set up schools, universities, one of which is even still going today, Gondishapur, in India. And they continued on this new study of the world. It's the beginnings of a new consciousness. And in class 5, we take the child into this new step. Now, by no accident do we do it in class 5, because around this age, around the age of 11, the child is starting to think in a new way. Earlier, the child thought more in pictures, in images. Now, around the age of 11, they start to think a bit more, even more abstractly than pictures. Piaget, the great Swiss developmental psychologist, described this as a step into what he called formal operations, where we start to look at the world more abstractly. We start to see where one thing causes another. The child in an earlier stage looks at the world as pictures, and that's why stories are so powerful for the younger child. They see in their own mind a picture and form a picture, and they understand it through a picture. Around from 11, generally on average, of course there are exceptions to this, but on average, around this age, the child starts to be able to put cause and effect together. And this is what happened historically around the times of ancient Greece. They started to see that one thing caused another, stepping out of the picture consciousness. And this is the beginnings of the consciousness that grew right across the world until we today are living with the results of thousands of years of these endeavors. Now this leads, of course, into a new empire. And in class 6, we take the children into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, of course, was the biggest empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, stretching all the way from Jerusalem in the east all the way up to Britain in the west. And the Romans bring a new, they build on that Greek consciousness, and they do it in a very powerful, almost brutal way, where they build massive buildings. They took the science and engineering to an extraordinary degree and built these massive buildings, which are still here today. And socially, politically, they also developed things. Julius Caesar, of course, was the great representative, one of the great individuals. And his murder in 44 BC, of course, produces a whole new step in the Roman Empire. It leads to Augustus becoming the emperor. And the empire spread all across all the surrounding the Mediterranean, all now becomes led by an emperor. And the ideal of the republic that had been the kind of founding ethos of Rome is overtaken by the cult of the emperor. Now, of course, new things start to emerge as well. And we take the children now, while we've pictured this build-up all the way up to ancient Rome, we now turn their attention toward the end of class 6 to a very interesting other story, because while Rome is thriving, we go back, Augustus had become the emperor, and he wanted to count the number of people who were in his empire. So he decides to have a census. It was the first census ever held. And he orders that everyone in their own country goes back to their hometown to be registered so they can count up how many people are in the Roman Empire. And way over in Palestine, over in the east of the Roman Empire, There's a man called Joseph who has to go back to his hometown of Bethlehem, where he registers himself. And there, of course, as we know the story, that's where the baby Jesus is born. And that leads to a whole new impulse in human life. Now, this impulse of Christ and the story of the crucifixion, the resurrection, becomes now a new element. What begins as just a small Jewish cult, in a sense, is taken up by the great person of Saul of Tarsus, who goes through his Damascus Road experience and becomes now a committed follower of the new Christian tradition. And he, as a Roman citizen and fluent in Greek and a very powerful orator, he spreads the message from being a Jewish kind of millennial cult into a worldwide religion until he reaches Rome. And there, the whole story of Christianity in human history now starts to unfold. Now, of course, soon after that, in the Middle East, a whole new religion emerges. And there is the religion of Islam, which with Muhammad and his revelation in around 600 AD, and a whole new development begins of Islam. But as Islam is building, so too is Christianity. And in 800 AD, we have Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, we've now moved into the main lessons of Year 7. And in Year 7, our students are moving into their next step. They're moving into puberty. They're moving into a more complex emotional life. And in Year 7, we take the children into the medieval world, which is this intermediate time known as the Middle Ages, the time between the ancient world and the modern world, just as the child of Year 7 is between childhood and adulthood. And in the Middle Ages, of course, we see a remarkable development of European culture. The Dark Ages come to an end, and there is this new flourishing of Christianity in Europe, and it builds these extraordinary and remarkable structures that are still inspiring to us today. But of course, there has to be, in a sense, a leading spirit. And one individual, the Dominican friar, Thomas Aquinas, puts together the new Christian doctrine and starts to understand it as a formal statement of philosophy. At the same time, there had been the Crusades, which had the great struggle with Islam, which had happened over the battles over who owned Jerusalem. And as those Crusaders had been over to the Middle East, they brought back from the Middle East many of the documents of ancient Greece, the things which Alexander had taken on his journeys through the Middle East. And the Crusaders bring these back to Europe. And there is a fusion of the old Greek wisdom of Aristotle with the new wisdom of Christianity. And together, this builds a whole new structure of medieval Christendom. But that leads then into a whole new phase. At the end of Year 7, early Year 8, we take them into the next step in human consciousness, which is the Renaissance. This remarkable time when the artists of the Renaissance, people like Leonardo da Vinci, start to produce these remarkable works of art. It's a flowering. And it's called the Renaissance, which really means rebirth. It was said to be a rebirth of the ancient wisdom, the ancient culture. But in a sense, it's actually a new birth. It's something new comes in human consciousness. A new freedom of thought, a freedom of expression starts to emerge in the Renaissance. And in all the work, the great works of those people, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, we see some extraordinary creativity that starts to flourish. We bring this to our students around the end of Year 7, Year 8, when they too are starting to feel themselves as individuals. These remarkable works that really are so inspiring to us still today. Over in England, of course, the Renaissance takes a slightly different form. It takes the form of drama and theatre, with Shakespeare as the great sort of prototype of the new age of the Renaissance. And around this time as well, of course, European humanity starts to go outside. It goes out to the wider world. Columbus crosses the Atlantic, and there they find a whole new civilization that Europe hadn't even dreamed of before. The Americas. They find these extraordinary civilizations of the Aztecs with their remarkable structures, the Incas, the Mayas, all the civilizations of the New World. And of course, it's a very bloody, sad story. of both knowledge and understanding, but also conquest, the negativities of colonialism. But it starts to build a wider world culture. Explorers go to Africa, and there they find these remarkable civilizations in Africa. They find the people, their whole cultures and civilizations of which they'd not been aware. Civilizations that had built up their own traditions of understanding of human life, their own cultures and their own worlds. Now, back in Europe, while this world culture is building, there is something new is happening, and people are starting to think in a different way. What's called the Enlightenment, where people start to think in a more rational, secular manner. The great figures of this are René Descartes, who was the great mathematician. He famously said, "I think, therefore I am." Now, this begins, in a sense, a new freedom in thinking in European humanity, which again starts to spread around the world. This leads into a new thinking in terms of machinery and understanding using technology, which leads into the Industrial Revolution. And in Year 8, we bring to the students this new way of thinking, this individual way of thinking, applying this new thinking, cause and effect, which had its origins with Aristotle. We now start to apply it in around 1700s, 1800s. It now comes into to be almost manifest in the world through new technologies, which build the Industrial Revolution. Now, the age of revolutions is a profoundly shaping experience for the modern world. It's really those revolutions that happened in the 18th, 19th centuries, firstly in technology, and secondly in political life, the revolutions of France, the revolutions of America, the revolutions that rattled Europe all through the 19th century. These revolutions are almost the birth pangs of the modern world. And what we live in as the modern world is the result of these 200 or 300 years of revolution in both thinking and in practical life and in social life and political life. And all through Year 8 and into Year 9, we bring these revolutions to our students so that they can really experience how the world that we live in today has been shaped. Now, all those revolutions had one interesting theme. They were overthrowing the old monarchies of the old regime. And one of the first things they did, it's very interesting, in both the French Revolution and the American Revolution, the first thing they did was to sit down and write a document that expressed what they felt were the individual rights of the human being. The French called it the rights of man, which man meaning humanity, mankind. And this sense of having to establish that each individual has unique rights and responsibilities, because law was set up to govern how we act toward each other. But the sense of individual rights now has come to be one of the key defining aspects of the modern world. The individual, not the individual as a member of a family, but as an individual. And this all culminated through all the kind of catastrophes, the kind of the revolutions, all the extraordinary things that went on through the 19th and 20th century. It all culminated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the first thing that the United Nations, when it was formed just after the Second World War, one of the first things they did was to sit down and write a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, of course, this document has been abused by some countries, but it's still there as a template for how we understand the rights of the individual. And it's, in a sense, a statement of the modern consciousness, the modern world. And we bring our students right up to this experience in Years 9 and 10, so that they've gained this journey through the main lessons to this point, which is the defining moment of the modern world. Now, in Year 11 and 12, we take them through a number of other main lessons in their own particular subjects, but there's a key theme expressed in both Year 11 with one particular guiding theme that Rudolf Steiner schools always do, and this is the story of Parsifal. And this is almost like a crowning jewel in the crown of the main lesson story. Parsifal is a story of a medieval knight, which may seem strange as being an old medieval story, but like many stories that were told in earlier times, they were prophetic of something that was to come. It's a wonderful story. It's a story about a young man finding himself. And it's not about men or it's not gender-based. It's actually a story about the individual coming to find who they are. And it's a wonderful story about a young man whose family, whose mother tries to stop him becoming something, but just through his own striving, he becomes wise and becomes, in a sense, we would say in a modern term, individuated. He finds his inner path or destiny through many trials and tribulations. Now, it's so important that a young person is able to experience a story such as this, that they can experience finding oneself, because all of us have been on this journey of self-discovery to find who we are and to find our place in the world. And so all the main lessons that we've had up to now, up to years 9 and year 10, have been the shaping of the modern world. And now we give them as a final gift this story that is worked through in the main lessons, which helps each individual student start to articulate their own journey to find who they are. And through the elements of the story, through sacrifice, through living for others, through being able to express one's deepest impulse, Parsifal finds his own place in the world, just as we want each of the young people in our care to find their place. And then finally in year 12, some schools that are able to do this present a final story, which is almost a defining story for our time, very strongly. It's the story of Faust. Faust is an old legend which was reworked by Goethe, the great German poet, into a drama for our time. And it's about a very clever man who was a philosopher, theologian, and doctor, who in a sense had all human knowledge at his disposal. But even after all of that, he was not happy or fulfilled. And as the famous story goes, he enters into a pact with the devil to almost sell his soul so he can find ultimate happiness. Now, it's a very powerful, potent story, but it's very much a story for our time. It's an allegory, it's a metaphor, it's an image of something. And it probably doesn't take too much of your own imagination to understand what this story is about. It's really about humanity today. Through our cleverness, we have gained all knowledge. We have gained so much. And yet what do we see in the world? We also see a lack of fulfillment, a lack of happiness. People want to find happiness, even with all the things, the knowledge that we have. And there's the question for us. Do we sell our soul for that? Or do we humbly find our own self, and through finding ourself, we find our path in life? And this is the great ultimate question that we have to leave our students with. So I've taken them on an enormous journey, all the way from, this is Faust being tempted by the devil, and then the decisions that he finally makes. He's finally redeemed, but only after great sacrifice. So we've been on quite a journey over the main lesson story. Let's go back to where we started, our first human consciousness. First Nations, embedded in the world. We live as part of families. Our life, in a sense, is governed for us. It's a beautiful, exquisite experience of being part of the natural world, supported by our community. Everything is laid out for us. Now today, in the modern world, we've come after all this time, the human mind wants to understand individual human rights, not based on families, but based on the individual. And this is the path that we are all on. And the question that we want to leave our students with is, if we've been through this process of separating out from the world, becoming a separate self, how do we now go on in this journey, having come down, if I can say, from this side, how as adults we can leave school, go out into the world and re-emerge, re-find ourselves in the world itself? How can we find ourselves in the world again as an individual? And that's the task that Dr. Rudolf Steiner gave us as educators. Our highest endeavour, as he put it, is to produce young men and women who out of themselves are able to find meaning and direction in their own lives. How do we do that? And that's what the task of a school is. Now, the future, of course, no one knows. Only the angels know what that future will be. But our task as educators is to help our students, to give them the experiences, the stories, the overall community that supports them, and all the skills that they themselves, out of themselves, can find a sense of meaning in life. We want them to feel that they are part of this grand human narrative, this great journey. All these generations before us who have come and have shaped the world, now we say it's your turn. It's your turn, over to you. You now play your part, and we want them to feel that they have a responsible part to play. What steps will they take to carry on this grand narrative, this great journey? What will their part be in the great human story? And that's how this overall curriculum really supports our students to play their part and find meaning in their life. So that's the main lesson journey. That's the from fairy tale to Faust. That's where we've gone. Journey of a long time. I hope it's been interesting, and I hope it's been valuable for you. And I wish you well on your journey as Rudolf Steiner educators. All the very best, and bye for now. Thank you.